Despite living in an era long before indoor plumbing, shampoo, and nail salons, the people of the Middle Ages used the best hygiene practices they could. That being said, they didn't have a lot to work with. Mostly straw and dirt, to be honest. So how did people keep clean in an era when most peasants only had one set of clothing? Well, we're glad you asked, because today we're going to take a look at what hygiene was like for medieval peasants. Before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, leave a comment and let us know what hygiene-related topics you would like to hear about. Okay, everyone hold your noses. This is going to be very unpeasant. Doctors in medieval times believed in a theory called humorism, which made connections between organs of the body, the seasons, the elements, and the tempers. This led them to believe that sickness happened when the body was out of balance, which was itself caused by parasites, which they thought originated inside people's bodies. What they didn't realize, however, was that it was actually poor waste management and some people's general failure to bathe that led parasites to be attracted to people. No matter how many times people washed their hands, the lack of understanding about the connection between filth, infestation, and sickness meant no one was safe from parasites and disease. But people still tried their best based on the knowledge of the time. In the modern era, frequent bathing is the norm. Just look at Ryan Gosling. But in the medieval era, things were a little different. Sure, rich folks could bathe in tubs of hot water, and the middle class could make use of public baths. But for the peasants, it wasn't so easy. Back then, there was no running water, so peasants had to haul water from wells or rivers to their homes by hand, which meant bathing required a lot of labor. That relatively small amount of water would then have to accommodate a relatively large number of people, maybe a whole family, and it was usually unheated. Privacy was also a luxury. Since most peasants didn't have a suitable area in their homes, they bathed outdoors, and they didn't always use soap, but when they did, it often consisted of an alkaline solution, such as a mixture of salt and lime, and they probably had to make it themselves. It barely seems worth the hassle, but most peasants performed manual labor all day, so they generally smelled like 17 varieties of butt. Bathing helped remove dirt, sweat, and odors, and it also helped them avoid lice and fleas. So while there were certainly those who never bathed, most peasants found the time for it, even if it didn't happen frequently. If you were the kind of medieval person who was lucky enough to live in a castle, then when it came time to do your business, you would sit on a bench with a hole placed over an opening leading to a cesspit, a gravity toilet, as it were. Peasants, on the other hand, didn't have it so good. They used outhouses, which were typically communal. Failing that, there was always a chamber pot or a waste bucket, but those needed to be emptied after use, usually into a nearby cesspit or river. And as for toilet paper, well, there was none. Instead, peasants used straw, grass, moss, or hay to wipe themselves. At the time, some believed the mere smell of waste caused disease, rather than the waste itself. So to get rid of that smell, some people dumped their contents out the window or into the street. Dumping chamber pots outside the house was frowned upon by society, and regulations were even created against such practices. But just like today, people often disregarded the rules. As you might imagine, it caused streets to become filthy, and whenever it rained, the water supply would get contaminated. Medieval peasants didn't have toothbrushes, so they used twigs to clean their teeth. They especially enjoyed using small branches from hazel trees, but failing that, some rubbed a piece of wool over their teeth and then rinsed their mouth with water. And while they obviously couldn't run down to the supermarket for some toothpaste, those who could afford it mixed things like salt and sage together to form a paste to freshen their breath and whiten their teeth. That being said, brushing wasn't as big a deal for them as it is for us. Why not? Because their diet included virtually no sugar, so they didn't suffer from many cavities. The stone-ground bread they ate, however, did cause their teeth to wear down, so it was a bit of a mixed bag there. If a peasant's dental hygiene wasn't good enough and they developed a problem with a tooth, they would have to have it removed. And as you might have guessed, medieval peasants didn't have a dental plan. they didn't even have dentists. No, if they needed a tooth pulled, they went to a barber. In fact, barbers performed most dental work back then. If that sounds like a nightmare, then it probably won't help to be reminded that there was no anesthesia available at the time. So patients basically just had to get drunk before having their teeth worked on. Alcohol, in fact, was a big part of medieval medicine, especially after surgeons discovered wine could be used to clean wounds. "Oh yeah, I'll be all right. Just pour some nitrate in there and let me get back to work." Medieval peasants spent a lot of their lives dealing with fleas and lice. In fact, parasites were such a problem that comb makers began adding finer teeth to their products so they could be used to remove dirt and lice. Alternatively, people could also use their fingers to do the job. And some folks would even get together with friends to delouse one another as a social activity, like karaoke, without the pressure. Clothing had to be deloused as well. Women skilled at delousing clothing and hair were in such demand that members of the Third Crusade even took them along on their journey. It was all the fun of delousing parasites combined with getting smote in a holy war. So we bet those women were having the time of their lives. There's not as much recorded on the topic of medieval feminine hygiene, but historians believe women resorted to using a variety of items to collect blood during their periods. Many, for example, probably used pieces of rags they tore up. Others likely wrapped strips of cloth around a small twig, or possibly collected absorbent moss and used it as a pad. It's also very likely some women did nothing and simply did their best to avoid staining their clothing. Religious authorities also placed great shame on menstruation, which could be one reason why there's so little written about it from that time. So many women felt they had to disguise it. To that end, they may have carried scented herbs or flowers with them to mask any smell. But considering medieval women didn't live all that long, and most live hard lives involving heavy labor and little sustenance, it's also possible that they had fewer menstrual cycles than women do in modern times. And speaking of women in medieval times, peasant ladies generally ran their households, which mostly means they prepared the food, milked the cows, tended to the garden, fetched the water, churned the butter, baked the bread, and milled the grain. Expectations of the time also gave women the responsibility of keeping the home clean, as well as their husband's clothing, and they were expected to remove fleas from their bedroom and bed. Etiquette and advice books of the era suggested women use white sheets so bugs and parasites could be easily spotted, and some women placed alder leaves around the room to deter parasites from gathering in the first place. Oh, most towns also expected people to keep the areas outside their homes clean, which is presumably why you see so many women aggressively sweeping their doorways in medieval movies. The next time you feel like you have nothing to wear, keep in mind that medieval peasants typically just had one set of clothes. As a result, they dressed in layers so as to avoid washing outer garments too often, which isn't too different from what we do today. How many days in a row have you worn a hoodie or a pair of jeans? Clothing worn next to the skin was made of linen, and heavier wool garments were worn on top of the undergarments. Even back then, people understood that washing their clothing helped keep parasites away, and etiquette books advised changing one's underwear every day. Of course, if you only had one pair of underwear, that wasn't really an option. Those who could afford more than one set of clothing instead typically changed into fresh garments once each week while washing their other outfit. Peasants who couldn't afford to send their garments to a professional laundress did their laundry themselves, washing their clothing in the river, typically with lye soap. Unfortunately, medieval rivers were often polluted with human waste, garbage, and runoff from animals' waste in the streets, so it was something of an uphill battle. The diet of medieval peasants consisted mostly of what they could grow on their farms, which included things like beans, grains, vegetables, and onions. That doesn't sound so bad, except for the fact that depending on how closely a peasant lived to a cesspit or contaminated water source, the soil used to grow that food and the water used to prepare meals could be easily tainted with human or animal waste. Yum! Since there was no refrigeration, fresh vegetables were an impossibility in winter, and the grains and root vegetables they stored could rot or become infested with vermin. Fungi could also poison grains if people weren't careful, and people could suffer bouts of stomach distress, diarrhea, or other illnesses due to spoiled food. And if the weather was poor and crops failed, many peasants simply starved. What about meat, you ask? Well, it was a luxury many peasants couldn't afford. But if they managed to earn enough to buy some, or slaughter one of their own animals, they had to dry the meat with salt, otherwise it would decay. Speaking of eating habits, medieval people rarely used cutlery aside from knives, so peasants generally ate with their hands. They washed their hands before and after every meal, but dirt trapped under fingernails or a poor hand-washing job could lead to food contamination, so it was a hit-or-miss practice at best. Surprisingly, for a time when most people were regularly covered in filth, popular etiquette also advised people to wash their face and hands after waking up, and to continue the practice of hand-washing throughout the day. And even peasants could do so, since it didn't require much water. Again, it didn't eliminate the risk of contamination, but it was better than getting crud all over the biscuits. Medieval peasants generally slept on beds made of straw, which were relatively comfortable and provided insulation. That doesn't sound so bad, but that straw had to be regularly changed to avoid bugs and vermin, and many didn't bother, or didn't do it frequently enough. As a result, peasants with these kinds of mattresses frequently suffered from bedbugs, fleas, lice, and rats infesting the straw. In order to combat all that disgustingness, people mixed scented flowers and herbs, such as mint, chamomile, and lavender, in with the straw. And if they could afford it, they had linen sheets and woolen blankets to cover themselves as they slept. That said, we would still avoid any Airbnbs run by medieval peasants. So, what do you think? Could you have lived as a peasant under these conditions? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.